Okay, so today we are going to look at brain regions, and I've got a couple of different ways to do it. The first one is to just get you started with identifying major structures on the whole brain, and then we'll also identify the major structures on the half brain. And so the first part of this, I just want to see how many of these things you can identify. And then once you identify what you can, I might give you a little bit more information and then have you try it again to see if you can then get another thing. But pause the video and get right to labeling anything that you have previous knowledge about for the brain regions. Okay, so I think always the first thing to start with is just the cerebrum versus the cerebellum. So I've kind of color-coded some of these where these are the ones that are kind of, they're not all big, but they're all pretty obvious. So they're the major sections that you wouldn't have to subdivide into other little sections later. So there's the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and then the pons and the spinal cord. And then I've subdivided it into the lobes. And the specific thing that gets subdivided into the lobes is the cerebrum. So technically the cerebrum is all of this right here. So anything that has the big folds, that is the cerebrum. So all of this stuff, and then what we'll do in just a little bit is we will subdivide all this into the other parts. So this right now, out of these four, all of that is the cerebrum. So most of the obvious stuff is taken up by the label of cerebrum. The cerebellum looks similar, except it's smaller and it has smaller folds. So the cerebellum is at the back of the brain here, the back and the base of the brain. And the numbers don't, like the numbers correspond to some things, but there are some numbers there that I'm not going to require you to know, just because that gets into too many details for right now. So on this one, number 21 nicely refers to the cerebellum, and that's great. But like number 18 and number 17 and 14 and 15, like those are numbers that we're not gonna really even focus on. So just so you know, the numbers might help you in navigating this particular image, but not necessarily, you don't have to know all of the numbers. All right, so then the last thing we have here are basically in this one again where the numbers come into play, number 19 and 22. So 22 is the small one that comes down here. That one is the spinal cord. And then 19, the last one, I put this one on here because you can see it, and it's one of the other structures that is visible from this side. That is what we call the pons. That's smaller. So those are kind of the main ones. And then I mentioned that you can take the cerebrum and split it into different parts or lobes. And so I'm going to draw the lobes and then try to give you a chance to identify the lobes even further if you can. So here is one particular lobe. Here is the boundary for another lobe. And then, oh, this guy at the back is a lobe. And the one that comes around on the side and folds around, that is another lobe. So 4 different lobes. So if you weren't able to get those originally, if I show you like this, can you pause and then see if you can get the lobes? And the way that I remember these lobes is F-pot. So if you start at the front, you have the frontal lobe. And just in orientation, so the eyes are going to be right here. So this is the front of the brain, the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. This is the top of the brain, and this is the bottom of the brain. So those particular lobes, the FPOT, kind of goes in a C structure, and that is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, which is more on top, the occipital lobe, which is at the back, and then the temporal lobe, or the temporal lobe, however you prefer to say that. So in that C structure, it goes FPOT. And since I just mentioned, we've got the front of the brain, the back of the brain, the top of the brain, and kind of the bottom of the brain, it's important to know those orientation words, because front and back, top and bottom, is not necessarily as meaningful as these particular ones, with the way the brain and the brainstem and the spinal cord comes up and tilts a little bit. So it's actually better to use rostral, caudal, dorsal, and ventral. And so if you think about something you know that has a dorsal fin, where would that dorsal fin be, right? And it's on the back, right, or on the top. And so the top of the brain is called the dorsal side. And then the opposite orientation to that is on the front, or the chest side, and that is ventral. So dorsal on top, ventral below that on the opposite side, and then you have front and back, and that is rostral or caudal. And I always remember this, like rostral is like nostril, and so it's closer to the nose, so it's really the front. Another way to remember it is rooster, and roosters have a beak, but rostral and nostril rhyme. And caudal actually means tail, so more towards the tail end. So these four, kind of north, south, east, west, rostral, caudal, dorsal, ventral. And then I think the next one that I'm going to look at is gyrus and sulcus. So a gyrus is a bump, and a sulcus is a valley. So when we are looking at these, the gyrus, I'm trying to think of like a big chunky one, and we'll give it a little highlight here. All right, so this surface area here is the gyrus. So a gyrus is the hill, whereas the sulcus is the valley. So the gyrus are all the bumps, and the sulci, the gyri and the sulci are all the dips. So a gyrus is a bump, the sulci is the dip, or the valley that goes in between the hills. And then for one particular sulcus that is really important, is the one that is labeled with the number 1 throughout here, and that is the central sulcus. So the central sulcus is the one that it actually splits the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So I've actually already drawn the line, but it's this number 1. As you can see, it goes down here. So it's a sulcus, or a valley, and it divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and then it also divides the gyrus that is here, that is labeled by the number 2, by the gyrus that is here, that is labeled by the number 3. And so the central sulcus, calling that the center, and then the gyrus that is right before that is the precentral gyrus, and the gyrus that is right after that is the postcentral gyrus. So the precentral gyrus is that number 2. Oops, I guess I can't make it come forward. But, so if you want to write on yours, you can just put number 2 right there. So that number 2 right here is the precentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is the one after the central sulcus. And that is, in this picture, labeled as number 3. And then the very last thing is, got something in the way of it here. So just remember the sulcus is the valley and the gyrus is the bump. But a fissure is basically a deeper sulcus. So a sulcus is just a fold, and it's not super deep, maybe like a 1/4 inch. But a fissure is a deeper valley, and it's maybe more like an inch or inch and a half, something like that, at least in the human brain. So the lateral fissure comes over here. It is this designated by the number 10. So it's the larger one, and it separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So during development, what happens is that the telencephalon starts to divide and get larger, and then one section of it wraps around, and that is what becomes the temporal lobe. So that there's a big space in between here. And that large space is called the lateral fissure. So I'll just kind of highlight that. Lateral fissure, getting a lot of highlights here, coming in number 10. So a bigger space right through here. All right, so that looks really complicated and ugly, but what I've done is I've actually given you another blank one if you want to go back and put all those in there, and then included on this I've added the functions of these. And it is getting really, really windy and stormy, so I need to pause and make sure that my house is okay. Okay, good news, the house is okay. So we had a little bit of hail and the kids were outside, but everything seems fine. Okay, so one of the things I did is I gave you an extra blank one of these. You can always create another blank one by going up to the top and clicking on duplicate that frame. But there is an extra one that's nice and clean so that you can do it again and give yourselves a little bit more practice. And then when we come over here, you can also go ahead and put those over there. So if you happen to label these, it will just help you associate especially the lobes with the particular functions of these. So, you can pause and go ahead and add those post-its back in to label those. And then I do want you to pause and give your best guess as to which of these sections, right? I've got all the white boxes correspond to one of these yellow ones down here that have a function on them. So just to recognize and identify the specific areas of the cerebrum and the cerebellum that are going to play a role in a specific function. So as best you can, if you happen to know, some people already know what the occipital lobe might do, a couple of functions in the temporal lobe, frontal lobe, and the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus also have a specific function as well. So do your best, see what you can do just by putting those in those particular areas. And so if you are having trouble right now, this is something you're going to work on, you're going to want to work on to memorize the different functions of the areas. So if we start with the frontal lobe is what humans have or it's more developed than for humans than it is for other animals. And so that is the place that gives us our ability to reason, gives us our ability to use logic, and it contributes in part to our quote-unquote personality. So that frontal lobe is reasoning, logic, personality. There are more things. These are kind of a little bit simplified. There's decision making. There is inhibition of other basic functions. So when I put these on here, this is just a general to get you started. So the frontal lobe, reasoning, logic, decision making. And then we'll go back this way because still in the frontal lobe, remember the central sulcus, this green line right here, that number 1, that was the border between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And so this gyrus, the precentral gyrus, is specific for one thing. And that one thing is for motor planning. So we'll look at this in a little bit detail coming up on one of the next objectives, but basically in this precentral gyrus, you have a map of the body that is able to control specific muscles in specific locations. And so when you are going to do a motor plan, so if I tell you to snap your fingers, right, that information comes in, you hear me say that, and then you create a motor plan, you process, am I going to do that? Do I really want to? And then you create a motor plan to do that, and then you snap your fingers. So that motor plan happens just in this one gyrus that is the precentral gyrus. Now, going back on the postcentral gyrus after that central sulcus into the parietal lobe, there is also a sensory map. So you have motor and sensory located next to each other so that they can, I don't know, easily communicate to each other. So the sensory sulcus or the primary somatosensory sulcus is this number 3. So this whole blue line right here, that is after the central sulcus. So the postcentral gyrus. And then going back into the parietal lobe, so the parietal lobe has a couple different functions. I put here just attention, but it actually, it's attention, it's location, and some movement processing is located in the parietal lobe as well. But we'll do attention and location for the parietal lobe here. Now the occipital lobe is one of the ones that's really mainly concerned with one type of processing, and that is vision. So the occipital lobe is going to process visual input to help us create a visual representation of the light information that we're seeing from the world. And then the temporal lobe is important for smell, audition. Here I have memory and smell. I put memory in here because that's where the hippocampus is located. It's not on the outer part of the cortex. It's on the more of an inner structure. You'd have to cut it to be able to see the hippocampus. But recognizing that the hippocampus is localized within the temporal lobe, not necessarily the temporal cortex. And then, so that's all of our lobes around here. And then you'll notice we have 3 other spots. One of them is important in balance and motor learning and coordination. And that one is the cerebellum. So balance and motor learning. And then there are 2 areas that are related to speech, and they were named after the people who discovered them. So Broca's, I always think, is broke, right? So Broca's is broke, and that is important in speech production. So if it's broken, you can't produce the speech. And that one is located in the frontal lobe, kind of at the barrier of the lateral fissure. So the border between the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe, but in the frontal cortex. Now, we call it Broca's area and we say it's one specific place, but actually there is individual variation in that, and it actually may not be localized in that one spot. It is different across individuals. So it might be slightly over here, slightly over there. Some people have it on one side versus the other side. So a lot of language processing is located in the left hemisphere. and not the right hemisphere. But there are some people who have it in the right and not the left, and there are actually some people who have it in both hemispheres. I had a student once who had a traumatic injury and ended up being a traumatic brain injury along with all the other injuries that he sustained. And the doctors were surprised that he was able to recover his speech because it was such an intense injury. And one of the reasons that they discovered he was able to recover his speech is that he had bilateralization, or speech production and recognition on both sides, which is relatively rare. So one of the reasons that he was able to recover so quickly is he had like a backup on the other side of his brain, because he did have damage on the left side of his brain. So kind of really interesting. And then the last area, Wernicke's area, is the understanding of speech. And that is located kind of at the transition of the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe.